Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, welcome. Pull up a blanket, turn the lights down a little. Maybe pour yourself something warm. Tonight, we are not doing anything stressful. Tonight, we are doing food. Specifically, we are doing the food of one of the most lavish, most overcrowded, most dramatically dysfunctional royal dynasties in all of human history. We are talking about the Mughals. Now, if you've never heard of the Mughal Empire, don't worry. We're going to get into all of it very slowly, very gently, at a pace that is specifically designed not to keep you awake. The Mughals ruled over most of the Indian subcontinent for about 3 centuries, give or take, starting in the early 1500s and limping along in various degrees of collapse until the British showed up and finished the job in the 1800s. They were Muslim rulers of Persian and Central Asian origin who built some of the most jaw-dropping monuments in human history. Yes, the Taj Mahal, if you were wondering. And they ate, by most accounts, extraordinarily well. And that is what we're here to talk about tonight. Not wars, not conquests, not the incredibly complicated politics of who stabbed whom and why. Just food, the daily meals, the kitchens, the spices, the cookbooks, the bizarre food rituals of emperors who had so much money and power that they genuinely had nothing better to do than obsess over whether their biryani was made correctly, which honestly is a relatable priority. So, let's just ease into this very gently. No rush, nowhere to be. The Mughal Empire, at its height, was one of the largest and wealthiest empires in the world. We're talking about a political entity that controlled something like a quarter of the world's entire GDP at various points. That is a genuinely staggering amount of money. And when you have that much money, and you are also an emperor, and you also happen to have deeply strong opinions about what you eat, which every single Mughal emperor did, by the way, every single one of them, then your kitchen becomes something very close to a small government unto itself. We're going to start at the very beginning, with Babur, the founder, the man who started it all, and who, bless his heart, was so homesick for Central Asian food that he spent half his time in India complaining about the produce. Then we're going to drift through the reigns of his descendants: Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, each of them with their own wildly different relationships with food, from the obsessive to the ascetic to the genuinely confusing. And along the way, we're going to talk about the kitchens, the cooks, the menus, the feasts, the famines, the spices, the recipes that survived, the etiquette that bordered on performance art, and the absolutely unhinged quantities of food that were prepared every single day for an imperial court that never seemed to get full. It's going to be a long evening, guys, but that's kind of the point. So, settle in. Let's start with a man who loved melons more than he loved almost anything else in his life. A man who wrote a memoir that is still considered one of the great works of world literature, partly because of how beautifully and honestly it captures the experience of being extremely homesick and also extremely tired. A man named Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad, though you probably know him as Babur. Babur was born in 1483 in Fergana, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan, and he had the kind of early life that would make most people give up entirely. He lost his father young. He captured the city of Samarkand, the glittering jewel of Central Asia, the city of Tamerlane himself, and then lost it almost immediately. He captured it again, lost it again. He was pushed out of his homeland by the Uzbek leader Shaybani Khan and spent years essentially wandering around with a band of followers who were loyal to him for reasons that probably had a lot to do with having nowhere better to go. Eventually, he ended up in Kabul, which he ruled for about 20 years and which he grew to genuinely love. And then, in 1526, he crossed into northern India, defeated Ibrahim Lodi at the First Battle of Panipat, and suddenly found himself the ruler of an enormous, hot, confusing, unfamiliar subcontinent. and his first impression of it was not great. This is documented. Babur wrote about it himself in his memoir, the Baburnama, which is an extraordinary document that we will be returning to repeatedly tonight, because Babur was, among other things, a man with strong opinions about fruit. He wrote about India with the kind of restrained disappointment that only a man who has been homesick for a very long time can manage. He noted that India had some good things. It had gold, it had money, it had elephants, it had a large workforce, but it lacked, in his view, some rather important qualities. The melons, for instance, were not up to standard. This is not a small complaint for Babur. Melons were serious business in Central Asian culture. The great melons of Fergana and Samarkand were celebrated, gifted, cherished. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal but entirely believable, that when someone brought Babur a melon in Hindustan early into his conquest, he cut it open, took a bite, and wept. Not because the melon was bad, necessarily, but because eating it reminded him so powerfully of home that the grief just sort of arrived without warning. If that doesn't resonate with you on some level, you've never eaten something that reminded you of a place you couldn't go back to. Babur's relationship with food was deeply personal and deeply tied to place and memory. He cataloged the foods of India with the careful, slightly critical eye of a man comparing a new restaurant to the one he grew up going to. India had mangoes, which he conceded were fine. It had bananas. It had sugar cane. It had a variety of vegetables he wasn't entirely sure what to do with. The grapes, he noted, were not as good as Kabul's. The pomegranates were acceptable. The cuisine, in general, lacked the refined Central Asian and Persian sensibility he had grown up with. But here's the thing about Babur. He was adaptable. He was pragmatic. He had survived too much to be precious about survival. And so even as he complained about the food, he also began the process of integrating, bringing his cooks and his culinary traditions with him. Yes, but also beginning to absorb the ingredients and techniques of the land he now ruled. This mixing is really the origin story of Mughal cuisine as we know it. The Mughals brought with them a culinary tradition that was rooted in the Persianic culture of Central Asia. Lots of slow-cooked meats, rice dishes, dried fruits, nuts, rosewater, saffron, subtle spicing that was about perfume and depth rather than heat. India, on the other hand, had its own ancient and extraordinarily sophisticated food traditions. Bold spicing, lentils, rice, flatbreads, an enormous variety of vegetables, and a long-established tradition of both meat cookery and vegetarian cuisine. When these two culinary worlds collided in the kitchens of the Mughal court, what came out was something genuinely extraordinary. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight, we're going to take this slowly. We're going to linger over every dish. We're going to talk about what people actually ate every day. Not just the emperors, but the nobles, the servants, the soldiers, the ordinary people living under Mughal rule. We're going to talk about breakfast and dinner, and the enormous midday meal, and the snacks, and the sweets, and the drinks. We're going to talk about kitchen politics, which was a genuinely dangerous profession, for reasons we'll get into later. And we're going to talk about the food that has survived, the dishes that are still being cooked today in some form, carrying 500 years of history in their spice blends. It's a lot of ground to cover. But the night is long and you're already comfortable. So, let's just keep going. Babur established himself in Agra after his victory at Panipat, and one of the first things he did, after dealing with the immediate political crises of running a newly conquered empire, was try to make the place feel livable. He planted gardens. This is well documented. He was an obsessive gardener, and the garden for him was inseparable from food and from the memory of Central Asia. He introduced the concept of the formal chahar bag, the four-part symmetrical garden, to the Indian subcontinent, and in those gardens, he planted fruit trees. He tried to grow the things he missed. He sent back to Kabul and beyond for cuttings and seeds. The kitchens of Babur's court were not yet the massive, highly organized, army-sized operations they would become under later emperors. Babur was still, in many ways, a conqueror living in a conquered city, surrounded by a court that was figuring itself out. But the foundations were being laid. He brought his own cooks, Persian and Central Asian trained. He inherited the kitchens of the Lodi Sultanate he had just defeated, which had their own traditions. And he was operating in a land that was, despite his complaints, absolutely bursting with ingredients he'd never seen before. The food at Babur's court during this early period was probably a fairly direct transplantation of Central Asian and Persian court cuisine, modified slightly by what was actually available. The key preparations would have included korma, slow-cooked meat in a sauce of fried onions and spices, an ancestor of the korma that exists today. There would have been pilaf, rice cooked with meat and aromatics, the ancestor of the biryani. There would have been kebabs of various kinds, both the flat, minced meat variety and the whole piece, skewered kind. There would have been flatbreads and the kind of slow-braised dishes that Central Asian cuisines excelled at. And there would have been dried fruits and nuts everywhere. Almonds, pistachios, raisins, dates. These were not just garnishes in this culinary tradition. They were fundamental ingredients, adding sweetness and texture to savory dishes, reflecting a cuisine that had evolved in places where fresh produce was seasonal and preservation was essential. Babur also drank, quite a lot actually. He mentions wine in the Baburnama with a frequency and fondness that suggests it was a significant part of his court life, even though he was a Muslim ruler and wine was technically prohibited under Islamic law. He went through phases of giving it up and then going back to it. He describes drinking parties in his memoir with the same matter-of-fact detail he uses to describe military campaigns. At some point, he apparently genuinely gave up alcohol. He was getting older, his health was declining, and the religious guilt was probably accumulating. But for most of his adult life, wine was on the table. This, too, would be a theme that ran through the Mughal dynasty in various forms. Some emperors drank enthusiastically. Some drank wine. Some preferred opium. Some, like Aurangzeb, eventually were austerely abstinent. But the relationship between the Mughal court and intoxicants was always complicated and always interesting. But let's stay with Babur for a moment longer. He died in 1530, just 4 years after his victory at Panipat. He was 47 years old. In those 4 years, he had established an empire, built gardens, written one of the great memoirs of the medieval world, and complained extensively about Indian fruit. He did not live long enough to see what his kitchen would become. But he planted the seeds, quite literally, in his gardens, of a culinary tradition that would flourish for 300 years. His son Humayun took over. And Humayun was a very different person. Humayun is one of those historical figures who is fascinating precisely because he was not particularly good at being emperor. He was intelligent, cultured, interested in astrology and philosophy and the arts. But he was also indecisive, occasionally erratic, and had a habit of losing his empire. He actually lost it completely to the Afghan ruler Shah in 1540 and spent 15 years in exile, first in Sindh, then in Persia, before finally recovering the throne in 1555. Those 15 years of exile are relevant to our food story for a very important reason. Humayun spent a significant portion of his exile at the court of the Safavid Shah of Persia, Shah Tahmasp. The Safavid court was one of the most sophisticated in the world at that time, a center of art, architecture, poetry, music, and yes, food. Persian cuisine, which was already the prestige cuisine of the Persianate world, was at its most refined at the Safavid court. Humayun absorbed all of this. He brought back with him, when he eventually returned to reclaim his throne, a cohort of Persian artists, architects, and craftsmen, and cooks. Persian culinary influence on Mughal cuisine, which had already been significant under Babur, deepened considerably under Humayun. What does that mean in practice? More saffron, more rosewater, more of the subtle, floral, layered seasoning approach that distinguishes Persian cuisine from its neighbors. More attention to color, the golden yellow of saffron-dyed rice, the red of pomegranate, the green of fresh herbs. More of the sweet-savory combinations that Persian cuisine loved, meat cooked with dried fruits, rice dishes with barberries, the interplay of tart and rich that still characterizes Persian food today. Humayun also had his own food eccentricities, which are perhaps best understood through his astrological obsessions. He organized his entire court according to an elaborate astrological system, assigning different activities and different clothes and different behaviors to different days, which were each governed by a different celestial body or sign. How this extended to food is a bit murky in the historical record, but it seems likely that there were certain foods associated with certain days, certain colors of food, saffron yellow on one day, perhaps, and something redder on another. This kind of ritual around food as symbol, food as ceremony, food as an extension of cosmic and political order, would become increasingly elaborate under the later Mughal emperors. But Humayun, like his father, died before he could see it reach its full expression. He died in 1556, not dramatically, not in battle, but by falling down the stairs of his library, which is, depending on your perspective, either a deeply undignified end for an emperor or a perfectly appropriate end for a man who cared more about books than battles. He was 47, same age as his father at death. His 13-year-old son became emperor, and that son turns out to be one of the most remarkable rulers in all of human history. His name was Jalal-ud-Din Muhammad Akbar. If you know one Mughal emperor by name, it's probably Akbar, and there are good reasons for that. He ruled for nearly 50 years, from 1556 to 1605. He expanded the empire enormously. He developed a sophisticated administrative system that kept it running. He pursued a policy of religious tolerance that was genuinely unusual for a ruler of any faith in the 16th century. He was illiterate, fascinating fact, but he had people read to him constantly and absorbed enormous amounts of information that way. And he ran a kitchen that was, by any reasonable standard, completely insane. We know about Akbar's kitchen in some detail thanks to a document called the Ain-i-Akbari, written by his court historian and administrator Abu el-Fazl Alami. The Ain-i-Akbari is one of those sources that historians get genuinely excited about because it's so specific. Abu al-Fazl didn't just write about what the emperor ate. He wrote about how the kitchen was organized, who was in charge of what, how food was prepared, how it was transported, how it was served, and even some of the actual recipes. It's basically the world's most elaborate restaurant inspection report, written in 16th century Persian prose. Let's start with the scale. Akbar's imperial kitchen, the royal kitchen that cooked for the emperor himself, was organized into a department called the Matbakh-i-Khas, or the special kitchen. This was distinct from the many other kitchens that operated within the imperial complex to feed the enormous court, the servants, the guards, the scholars, the visitors, and everyone else who happened to be in the vicinity of the Mughal emperor at any given moment. The special kitchen had its own superintendent, a senior official of high rank and considerable trust. Below him were a network of cooks of various specializations, tasters, supervisors, and support staff. Food was never prepared and served without going through multiple layers of supervision and verification. Why? Because poisoning was a genuine and not entirely paranoid concern in Mughal court life. It was not unknown for political enemies to attempt to poison a ruler. The solution was an elaborate ritual around food preparation and delivery. Dishes were sealed with cloth and then marked with the superintendent's official seal after preparation. They were carried from the kitchen to the emperor's quarters in a procession, with guards. Before any dish was served to the emperor, it was tasted by the superintendent himself. If the superintendent did not drop dead, the emperor ate. This is not unique to the Mughals, by the way. Food tasting for rulers was a standard feature of courts around the world. But the Mughal system was particularly well documented and particularly elaborate. And it speaks to something important about the nature of the power in this context. The emperor's body was the empire, in a very real sense, and protecting it from harm was not merely a personal matter, but a political one. Now, what did the emperor actually eat? Akbar's personal diet was, by all accounts, relatively moderate for an emperor. And I say relatively because we are comparing it to a baseline of extraordinary excess. He ate once or twice a day. He was not a particularly enthusiastic meat eater. There were periods when he reduced or eliminated meat from his diet entirely, influenced by the Hindu and Jain religious ideas he encountered and found genuinely interesting. He was known to favor certain dishes. He was particularly fond of a preparation called khichdi, which is, at its most basic, a dish of rice and lentils cooked together. Now, khichdi sounds humble, and in its everyday form, it is humble. It's comfort food. It's what you eat when you're sick or when you want something simple and warm. But the imperial version of khichdi was quite different. It was made with fine rice, cooked slowly, often with butter or ghee, sometimes with spices, sometimes with additions of meat or vegetables. It could be made very rich and elaborate, and Akbar apparently loved it. He also liked a rice dish called yakhni pulao, rice cooked in a seasoned meat broth, fragrant with whole spices with pieces of tender meat. This is a dish of Persian ancestry, and it is, in its Mughal form, a direct ancestor of the biryani. We'll talk about the biryani at length, don't worry. The court also ate a lot of flatbreads, particularly a bread called naan, which was cooked in a tandoor oven and which was already becoming associated with Mughal court cuisine. The tandoor was a clay oven buried partially in the ground, fired with charcoal, reaching very high temperatures. It produced bread with a characteristic char and chew that you could not replicate any other way. The bakers who operated the tandoors were specialists. The bread itself was consumed fresh. It had to be, really, and it was an important part of every meal. Meat was central to the court diet, even when the emperor himself was going through a vegetarian phase. The court ate a lot of goat. Goat was the standard red meat in this part of the world, preferred over beef, which was symbolically fraught given the Hindu majority of the population, and mutton from sheep. They ate venison. They ate various game birds, partridge, quail, pheasant. They ate chicken, though chicken was sometimes considered slightly low status compared to game. The preparation of meat in Mughal court cuisine was sophisticated and varied. There was korma, the slow braised meat in spiced onion sauce. There was rogan josh, meat cooked in a sauce-colored red with dried chili and spices. There was nahari, a slow-cooked dish, traditionally simmered overnight, made from the tougher cuts of meat and bone marrow, spiced with a complex blend. There were various kebabs, Sikh kebab, which is minced meat on a skewer, and boti kebab, which is cubed meat marinated and grilled, and shami kebab, which is a patty of minced meat and lentils, and a dozen other regional variations. Each of these dishes had its own protocols, its own specialists, its own seasonal associations. And this is before we've even gotten to the fish, the sweets, the beverages, or the enormous array of condiments and accompaniments that were served alongside the main dishes. The Mughal court ate a lot. Let me put some numbers on this. Abu al-Fazl records in the Ain-i-Akbari the quantities of ingredients that were requisitioned for the imperial kitchen daily. These numbers are staggering. We're talking about hundreds of kilograms of meat, enormous quantities of rice and flour, massive amounts of ghee, clarified butter, which was the primary cooking fat and which was used with a generosity that would make a modern cardiologist weep. Bags and bags of spices, sacks of dried fruits and nuts. Ceaseless quantities of milk, used both for cooking and for making the yogurt and cream that appeared in sauces and drinks and desserts. This was not food for just the emperor. This was food for the entire royal household, the court, the staff. But even accounting for that, the quantities were extravagant. The Mughal court lived at a level of material excess that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. Let's talk about spices for a while, because it's impossible to understand Mughal food without understanding the role of spice. When most people today think of Indian food, they think of it as spicy, meaning hot. And it's true that chili heat is a characteristic feature of a lot of Indian regional cuisines. But here's the thing. Chili peppers are a new world crop. They arrived in India only after the Portuguese began trading along the coasts in the early 1500s, which means that when Babur arrived in India in 1526, chili peppers were either just arriving or had not yet arrived at all. The heat in early Mughal court food came primarily from black pepper and long pepper and ginger. These are very different kinds of heat from chili. Earthier, more aromatic, less sharp. As chili gradually made its way into Indian cooking through the 16th century, it was absorbed into both regional cuisines and court cuisine, but slowly and unevenly. By Akbar's time, it was probably present in the kitchen, but it was not yet the dominant source of heat it would become. What the Mughal kitchen was absolutely committed to, from the very beginning, was aromatic spicing. The spices that defined Mughal court cuisine were not primarily about heat. They were about perfume, depth, complexity, and the layering of flavors that required slow cooking and careful balance. Let's go through some of them. Saffron, the most expensive spice in the world, then as now. Grown in Kashmir, which the Mughals controlled and imported from Persia. Used to color rice a brilliant gold, to perfume sauces, to add a subtle, haunting floral quality to sweets and drinks. The use of saffron in a dish was a statement of wealth and refinement, it said. We have the resources to use the most precious spice on earth without measuring it carefully. Akbar's court used it lavishly. Cardamom. Both green and black cardamom were used extensively. Green cardamom, small, intensely fragrant, with a sweet, almost mentholated quality, went into everything from biryanis to desserts to the spiced tea-like beverages of the court. Black cardamom, larger, smokier, more camphor-like, was used in savory dishes and slow-cooked meats. It has a quality that is almost impossible to substitute. It adds a kind of deep, dark, smoky complexity that takes a dish somewhere green cardamom cannot go. Cinnamon. Not the mild, sweet cassia variety that dominates in Western cooking today, but true cinnamon, thinner, more delicate, more complex, used in rice dishes, in meat preparations, and sweets. Cloves, strong, pungent, slightly medicinal. Used whole in rice dishes, you'd often bite into one unexpectedly, a small, intense burst of flavor. Used in spice blends. Used in the preparation of betel, the digestif that Mughal courtiers consumed after meals, which we'll get to. Black pepper, the old king of spice, still fundamental even after chili arrived. Mughal sauces were often pepper-forward in a way that modern versions of these dishes sometimes aren't. Cumin, both whole seeds and ground, toasted until fragrant and added to dishes in multiple stages of cooking. One of the most fundamental flavors in this cuisine. Coriander, seeds ground, a warmer, slightly citrusy spice, often paired with cumin. Turmeric, the golden root, dried and ground, adds color and a slightly bitter, earthy quality. Ubiquitous, fenugreek, seeds and leaves, slightly bitter, slightly maple-like, used in both cooking and in some breads. Asafoetida, called hing in Hindi, a resin with an intensely pungent, sulfurous smell when raw that transforms into something deeply savory and almost garlicky when cooked. used in small amounts, particularly in vegetarian cooking. A key flavoring agent, mace and nutmeg, the outer lace and inner seed of the same fruit. Warm, rich, slightly sweet. Used particularly in meat dishes and in the more elaborate court preparations. Rose petals and rose water. Not spices exactly, but aromatic ingredients of great importance. Rose water was used in biryanis, sprinkled over the rice during the final cooking stage to add fragrance. Rose petals were used in sweets and in the drinks served at court. Kelra water, made from the flowers of the pandanus plant. Another aromatic essence with a quality that is floral and slightly grassy. Used much as rosewater was, to add fragrance to rice dishes and sweets. These ingredients didn't just flavor the food. They were also, in the medical understanding of the time, medicinal. Mughal medicine followed the Unani tradition, derived from the ancient Greek funeral system, developed through centuries of Islamic scholarship, integrated with Ayurvedic traditions from India. Food and medicine were not separate categories in this worldview. What you ate determined your physical and moral health. Certain spices warmed the body, others cooled it. Certain foods were appropriate for certain seasons, certain ages, certain constitutions. The imperial kitchen operated with an awareness of these ideas that shaped what was cooked and when. The court physician had an advisory relationship with the imperial kitchen, which is actually a surprisingly sensible approach to institutional catering. What did a day of eating look like at the Mughal court? This is going to require some generalizing, because the court changed significantly from emperor to emperor, and because the historical sources don't always give us a detailed hour-by-hour account. But we can piece together a reasonably clear picture from Abu Fazl's account, from traveler descriptions, and from later Mughal sources. The day at the Mughal court began early, very early. Emperors were expected to present themselves to their subjects at dawn. There was a ritual called Jaraka-i-Darshan, in which the emperor appeared at a window or balcony to be seen by the public, and this happened at sunrise. The symbolic power of the emperor appearing as the sun rose was intentional and important. Before all of this, the emperor would have had some kind of morning refreshment. This is not always detailed in the sources, but it probably involved warm beverages. Possibly a sweetened, spiced milk drink, possibly something herbal. Fruit, if it was available and of good quality. Perhaps some dried fruits and nuts. Something light, essentially, before the business of the day. Breakfast as a distinct formal meal is somewhat hard to identify in the Mughal context. The main eating event of the day was a meal served in the late morning or early afternoon, what we might think of as lunch, though it was the most substantial meal of the day. This meal was elaborate. This is the meal that the special kitchen was primarily organized around. Dishes were brought in sequence and with ceremony. Rice dishes, pilaf, biryani, formed the centerpiece. Around them came meat preparations of various kinds, lentil dishes, vegetable preparations, bread, condiments, pickles, chutneys, raitas made with yogurt, salads of various kinds, and then sweets. The emperor ate alone, or nearly so. This was a feature of Mughal court etiquette. The emperor did not generally dine communally with his courtiers. He ate in a private space, attended by personal servants and the kitchen superintendent. The courtiers themselves ate separately, served from the imperial kitchen in portions proportional to their rank and closeness to the emperor. Food allocation was, in fact, an instrument of imperial favor. Abul Fazl describes a system in which nobles and officials received different quantities and qualities of food from the imperial kitchen according to their rank. Receiving food from the emperor's kitchen was a mark of status. Receiving food from the dishes that had actually been served to the emperor, leftovers from the imperial table, essentially, was an even greater honor. This practice of distributing food as patronage ran throughout Mughal culture. The emperor fed people, literally. This was not just about sustenance, but about the expression of power and generosity that was central to how legitimate rule was understood. The emperor as the provider, the source from which all nourishment flowed. After the main meal, there would be a rest period, particularly in the hot months, when an afternoon break was both physically sensible and culturally normal. And then in the evening, a lighter meal, snacks, sweets, fruit. The evening meal was generally less elaborate than the midday meal, though this varied considerably from one reign to another. And then there was the betel. Betel, pan in Hindi, deserves its own discussion because it was genuinely central to the post-meal culture of the Mughal court. Betel consists of leaves of the betel plant wrapped around a filling that typically includes areca nut, slaked lime, and various flavorings, cardamom, cloves, saffron, rosewater, sweet preserves, and sometimes more exotic additions. The whole package is folded into a small triangle and chewed after meals. The betel nut contains mild stimulants. It produces a sense of mild alertness and well-being, and slightly increases saliva production, which aids digestion. It stains the mouth and teeth red over time, a quality that was considered attractive by some standards and alarming by others, particularly foreign visitors who were not accustomed to it. At the Mughal court, the serving of betel after meals was a ritual. The emperor's personal betel box was an item of considerable importance, maintained by a dedicated official. Presenting betel to a guest was an act of hospitality and honor. Particular preparations of betel were considered especially refined. Certain combinations of ingredients, wrapped in a specific way, offered a sensory experience of extraordinary complexity. Foreign visitors to the Mughal court noticed betel chewing immediately, and most of them found it somewhere between curious and alarming. But it was so embedded in the culture that by the 17th century, European diplomats and merchants who spent time at the court often adopted it themselves. We need to talk about Jahangir. Jahangir was Akbar's son, and he ruled from 1605 to 1627. He was, in many ways, a man of extraordinary sensibility and somewhat questionable judgment. He was a gifted observer. His memoirs, the Tuzuki Jahangiri, are celebrated for their detailed, acute descriptions of the natural world. He was a passionate connoisseur of art and had an eye for quality that was genuinely remarkable. He married Nur Jahan, who was one of the most capable politicians of the entire Mughal dynasty and effectively ran significant portions of the empire. And he drank. A lot. Jahangir was, by his own honest account in his memoirs, a heavy drinker for much of his adult life. He describes his drinking habits with a frankness that is either admirably self-aware or slightly alarming, depending on your perspective. He tells us that he began drinking wine as a young man, that his consumption increased over time, that at his peak he was drinking 20 cups of double-distilled wine a day, and that this caused some health problems. He also consumed opium. This was not unusual in the Mughal court. Opium was widely used throughout the empire, for pain relief, for recreation, for what was understood as medical purposes. But Jahangir's opium use, combined with his drinking, created a dependency that his courtiers were very much aware of, and that made managing his reign complicated. In later life, Jahangir did try to reduce his consumption. He describes these attempts in his memoirs with a kind of weary self-knowledge. The detailed accounting of someone who has been trying and failing to moderate a habit for years. He would cut back on wine and increase opium instead. He would abstain for a period and then relapse. It was a pattern. What does all this have to do with food? Well, directly, it affected Jahangir's appetite and his relationship with food. Heavy drinkers often have complicated appetites. But more interestingly, Jahangir was also a man with strong and specific food preferences that he documented carefully. He had a particular love of certain kinds of meat. He was fond of game hunting. Like his father and grandfather before him, hunting was a central aristocratic activity. And the game he hunted ended up on his table. He describes meals that included various wild birds, deer, antelope. He had opinions about which preparations were best. He was the kind of eater who notices what he's eating and remembers it and has something to say about it. He was also interested in the food of other regions and cultures. He received ambassadors and visitors from various parts of the world, including Sir Thomas Roe, the English ambassador, who attended his court for several years, and he was curious about their customs and foods. He didn't necessarily adopt or particularly enjoy foreign foods, but he was interested. Jahangir also presided over a court that continued the culinary trajectory established under Akbar, the gradual deepening and elaboration of a cuisine that was becoming increasingly distinct from both its Central Asian origins and its local Indian context. Mughal court cuisine was, by Jahangir's time, its own thing. It had its own identity, its own techniques, its own repertoire of dishes. One development worth noting in this period is the continued evolution of the dum cooking technique. Dum, from the Persian word for steam or breath, refers to a method of cooking in which food is sealed in a pot and cooked over low heat, steaming gently in its own moisture and the moisture of the ingredients. The pot is typically sealed with dough to trap the steam. The result is extraordinarily tender meat and rice that has absorbed all the flavors of whatever it was cooked with. This technique would eventually give us the dum biryani, one of the signature achievements of Mughal court cuisine. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Let's hold the biryani for a few more pages. In the meantime, let's drift over toward another aspect of life at the Mughal court that is often overlooked in the standard historical narrative. Let's talk about what the cooks themselves ate. The imperial kitchen was a world unto itself. Abu al-Fazl describes a highly organized hierarchy of kitchen workers that included not just cooks, but a whole support structure of people who made the kitchen function. There were the head cooks, the masters of their particular specializations, who had likely trained for years and who commanded considerable respect within the kitchen hierarchy. There were junior cooks who worked under them. There were the people who managed the fires and the fuel supply. There were the people responsible for sourcing and receiving ingredients. There were the water carriers. There were the people who washed and maintained the enormous array of vessels, the copper pots, the clay bowls, the serving dishes of various materials. The vessels themselves were significant. Mughal court cuisine was cooked and served in vessels of different materials depending on the dish and the context. Copper was widely used for cooking. It conducts heat well and allows for precise temperature control, though it requires regular maintenance to keep the tin lining from wearing off and the copper itself from leaching into food. Stone vessels, particularly the distinctive black stone of certain Indian quarries, were used for certain preparations. Gold and silver serving dishes appeared at the imperial table for formal occasions. Silver was believed to have purifying properties and was considered appropriate for royal dining. The water supply was also carefully managed. Water was not just water in the Mughal kitchen. It was sourced from specific wells and rivers known for their purity, carried in sealed vessels, and treated with a degree of care that reflected both practical hygiene concerns and the ritual importance of purity in food preparation. The cooks themselves occupied an interesting social position. They were skilled workers, specialists with valuable expertise. The head cooks of the imperial kitchen were not low-status figures. They were well compensated, they were trusted, they had access to the most private spaces of the imperial household. The man who cooked the emperor's food was, in some sense, one of the most intimately connected people in the emperor's world. But they were also acutely aware of the political risks of their position. If a dish was not up to standard, consequences could follow. If an emperor was ill after eating, and suspicion fell on the kitchen, even if the illness had nothing to do with the food, the consequences could be severe. Working in the imperial kitchen required constant political alertness alongside culinary skill. There are scattered historical accounts of kitchen crises, incidents where food was substandard, or where accusations of poisoning arose, or where kitchen staff became implicated in court intrigues. The kitchen was connected to too many things to remain purely functional. It touched the emperor's body, which meant it touched power directly. Outside the imperial kitchen, the special kitchen, there were many other kitchens operating within the Mughal palace complex and the broader court. The kitchens that fed the harem, the imperial zanana, were separate from the emperor's kitchen and operated under their own hierarchy. The harem was a vast establishment. Akbar's harem is said to have housed thousands of women, though the exact numbers and conditions varied. All of these people needed to be fed every day. The food served in the harem kitchens was substantial and varied. It had to be, given the diversity of women who lived there, who came from different regions, different backgrounds, different religions. There were Hindu women from Rajput royal families. Akbar pursued a deliberate policy of marrying women from Rajput noble families as a way of building alliances. There were Muslim women from various parts of the Islamic world. There were women from different parts of the subcontinent with very different food preferences and cultural backgrounds. The harem kitchens had to accommodate all of this, which meant that the food produced there was probably even more diverse than the food at the emperor's table. And this diversity is one of the reasons Mughal court cuisine developed the range it did. When you are feeding a large community of people from many different backgrounds, you accumulate and preserve many different culinary traditions. Some of them get absorbed into the mainstream of what the court eats. Some survive in more specialized contexts. All of them contribute to the overall development of the cuisine. Let's talk about rice. Rice was the king of the Mughal table. Not bread, though bread was important and we'll get to it. Not meat, though meat was prestigious and central. Rice. The great pilaf tradition that the Mughals brought from Central Asia and married to the rice-growing traditions of the Indian subcontinent produced a body of rice cookery that is genuinely one of the great achievements of world cuisine. In Central Asian and Persian cooking, the great rice dish is the pilaf, called polo in Persian, palau in Hindustani, pilaf in the Western adaptation. The basic concept is rice cooked in a flavored broth, usually with meat and aromatics, so that the rice absorbs the flavor of the cooking liquid as it cooks. The result, when done well, is rice in which every grain is separate and perfectly cooked, infused with a complex, savory, fragrant flavor that could never be achieved by cooking the rice in plain water and adding things on top. The technique matters enormously. You must wash the rice carefully to remove excess starch. You must soak it to allow even cooking. You must calculate the ratio of liquid to rice precisely. You must manage the heat carefully so the rice at the bottom forms a crust, the tadig in Persian, the sosarat equivalent, without burning. You must time the addition of the meat and other ingredients so that everything finishes cooking at the same moment. A great pilaf is a feat of coordination and timing. The Mughal kitchen inherited this tradition from Babur and Humayun and developed it into something extraordinary. The pilafs of the Mughal court ranged from the simple and elegant, rice cooked in a clear meat broth, fragrant with whole spices, topped with fried onions that have been cooked until they are almost caramelized, to the spectacularly complex. There were pilafs colored with saffron and filled with dried fruits and nuts. There were pilafs cooked with whole bird, a partridge or quail or chicken, placed in the center of the pot and cooked as the rice cooked around it, so that when the dish was unmolded, the bird was revealed in the center, surrounded by perfectly cooked, fragrant rice. There were pilafs cooked with various meats and with layers of different colored rice alternating in the pot, creating a visual effect when served. And then there was the biryani. The biryani's exact origin story is contested. This is a dish that has passionate advocates who claim it for various regions and traditions, and the debates can get surprisingly heated for a discussion about rice. But in its Mughal incarnation, the biryani is understood to be a development of the pilaf tradition, specifically using the dum cooking technique we mentioned earlier. In a dum biryani, partially cooked rice and partially cooked meat are layered in a pot. Aromatics, fried onions, saffron, rosewater, kura, herbs are added between the layers and on top. The pot is sealed with dough and placed over low heat, so that the steam trapped inside finishes cooking everything. When the seal is broken at the table, a puff of fragrant steam escapes. And this moment, this release of the fragrance, is theatrical and intentional. It is part of the experience. The biryani as we know it today, in its many regional variations, from the Hyderabadi dum biryani to the Lucknow biryani to the Kolkata biryani, is a direct descendant of this Mughal court preparation. The lineage is traceable. The technique is the same. But let's not skip over khichdi, which we mentioned briefly in relation to Akbar, and which deserves more attention. Khichdi is one of the oldest food preparations in the Indian subcontinent. There is textual evidence for versions of it going back more than 2,000 years. At its simplest, it is rice and lentils cooked together until soft and somewhat porridge-like, seasoned with ghee and spices. It is humble, comforting, easily digestible, and the kind of food that people turn to when they are tired or unwell or just want something uncomplicated and warm. But the Mughal court did not do uncomplicated, even with khichdi. There were elaborate court versions of khichdi, prepared with fine rice, with carefully balanced lentils, with quantities of ghee that transformed it from humble porridge into something rich and deeply satisfying. There were versions with meat added. There were versions with eggs. There were versions with spicing so complex that the dish barely resembled its peasant ancestor. Emperor Akbar's fondness for khichdi was probably, in part, a deliberately cultivated gesture of simplicity, or at least what counted as simplicity in an imperial context. Choosing a peasant dish as your preferred food, even in its palatial version, carries a certain symbolic weight. It says something about modesty and groundedness, even if the dish in question is made with the finest rice in the empire and enough ghee to fuel a small village. The famous Mughal traveler and diplomat Sir Thomas Roe, who was at Jahangir's court in the early 17th century, noted that khichdi was widely eaten throughout Indian society by people of all classes, adjusted in richness according to what they could afford. This universality is part of its power as a symbol. Now let's talk about bread. Flour-based foods were the other great category of staple carbohydrate in Mughal court cuisine, and the range of breads and flatbreads produced in the imperial kitchen was impressive. The most important of these was naan, the leavened flatbread baked in the tandoor. Mughal naan was made from refined wheat flour, maida, leavened with a yeast starter, sometimes enriched with milk or yogurt, stretched thin and slapped against the inside wall of the hot tandoor to bake quickly. The result was bread with a characteristic chew and lightness, slightly charred in spots, pulling away from the oven with pockets and bubbles. The Mughal court ate naan fresh with every meal. The bread bakers, the naan bai, were specialists, and their position in the kitchen hierarchy reflected the central importance of their product. Fresh bread for an imperial household of hundreds required constant production. The tandoors of the imperial kitchen never went cold. There were many varieties of naan prepared at court. There was plain naan, the everyday version. There was nanai tunuk, a thinner, more delicate version. There was naan enriched with eggs and milk and sometimes stuffed with minced meat, or dried fruits and nuts. There was naan rubbed with ghee and folded to create a layered, flaky effect, the ancestor of the paratha. The paratha, a layered flatbread cooked on a griddle with ghee rather than in the tandoor, was its own category. Parathas could be plain or stuffed. Stuffed parathas filled with spiced potatoes, with minced meat, with paneer cheese, with various vegetables were and remain one of the great everyday foods of the region. The court probably ate stuffed parathas at breakfast or as lighter meals. They are satisfying and portable in a way that naan is not. There was also puri, a small round flatbread that puffs dramatically when it hits hot oil, fried rather than baked. Puris were served at special occasions and had a festive, celebratory quality. Their dramatic puffing up in the oil, each one inflating like a small balloon before collapsing into a tender, slightly chewy disc, made them visually delightful to prepare and serve. And there was roti, the plain whole wheat flatbread cooked on a dry griddle, the most everyday bread of the common people. Roti was not the bread of choice for the court, where refined flour and enriched breads were preferred. But it was the bread that the vast majority of people under Mughal rule ate every day. Simple, nutritious, unleavened, cooked in minutes, the foundation of ordinary meals throughout the subcontinent. Alongside the bread, there was always ghee, clarified butter, cooked until the milk solids caramelize and are removed, producing a pure golden fat with a deep, nutty flavor and a very high smoke point, was the primary cooking fat and also a condiment. A piece of fresh roti with a spoonful of ghee melted over it is one of those simple food experiences that defies its simplicity. Ghee was also poured over rice, used to enrich dal, and added to sweets. In the medical understanding of the time, ghee was considered deeply nourishing and beneficial in many contexts. The better quality the ghee, made from the milk of well-fed cows, clarified carefully, the more it was valued. Butter also appeared on the court table, but ghee was the prestige fat. Butter, being unprocessed, spoiled quickly in the Indian climate. Ghee could be stored for months or longer without refrigeration. The history of Mughal court cuisine tends to focus on the meat dishes and the elaborate rice preparations, because those are the most glamorous. But there was another whole category of food on the Mughal table that was equally important and is sometimes overlooked. Dal, lentils, in their many forms, was fundamental. India has been cooking lentils for thousands of years, and the range of dal preparations that exist across the subcontinent is extraordinary. There are hundreds of varieties of legumes, lentils, split peas, chickpeas, various beans, each with different flavors, textures, and cooking requirements. Each region had its preferred varieties and preparations. At the Mughal court, dal was prepared in ways that reflected the court's synthesis of Central Asian and Indian traditions. There was dal cooked with ghee and spices, a simple but deeply satisfying preparation. There was dal cooked with meat and lentils together, the lentils absorbing the richness of the meat and its cooking liquid. There was dal cooked with dried fruits, reflecting the Central Asian tendency to add sweetness to savory dishes. There was a preparation called dal makhani, black lentils slow-cooked with butter and cream, which, in various forms, has become one of the most beloved dishes of North Indian cooking, and which almost certainly has Mughal court antecedents. The tarka, a technique of briefly frying whole spices and aromatics in ghee, and then adding them to a finished dal, was and remains central to dal preparation. The sizzle of cumin seeds and dried chilies hitting hot ghee, the burst of fragrance, and then the hiss and pop as the tarka is poured over the finished lentils. This is one of those cooking sounds and smells that is fundamentally associated with a particular food culture. Vegetables also appeared on the Mughal table, though they were not the centerpiece of court cuisine in the way that meat was. India's extraordinary diversity of vegetables, many of them not found elsewhere in the world at that time, provided ample material for the kitchen. Eggplant, gourds of various kinds, okra, spinach and other leafy greens, turnips, radishes, fenugreek leaves, bitter melon, lotus root, the list goes on and on. Vegetables were prepared in ways that the court had developed from both local and Persian traditions. There were vegetable preparations with complex spicing, onion-based sauces, yogurt-enriched dishes, preparations that used the full range of the spice cabinet. There were stuffed vegetables, hollowed-out gourds filled with spiced minced meat, eggplants stuffed with spiced onions and nuts, paneer, a fresh cheese made by curdling milk with acid and pressing the curds, also appeared in the Mughal court kitchen, though it was probably not the ubiquitous ingredient it has become in modern North Indian cuisine. Paneer is a cheese that can be cooked without melting, which makes it uniquely versatile for cooking. It absorbs flavors. It holds its shape when cubed and sautéed. It provides a mild, milky richness. The dish now known as palak paneer. Spinach with paneer has antecedents in Mughal court cooking. Curd, yogurt, was another fundamental ingredient. Used in marinades for meat, the lactic acid in yogurt tenderizes protein very effectively, and the spices mixed into a yogurt marinade penetrate deeply into meat during a long soak. Used in sauces. Used as a condiment. Raita, yogurt mixed with cucumber or other vegetables and spices, was a standard accompaniment to rich rice dishes, providing a cooling contrast. Drunk as a beverage, the drink called lassi, made from yogurt beaten with water and flavorings, was consumed at court and throughout the population. The man who built the Taj Mahal, if Akbar represents the political and cultural high point of the Mughal Empire, Shah Jahan represents the aesthetic high point. He ruled from 1628 to 1658, and his reign was characterized by extraordinary architectural patronage. The Taj Mahal, obviously, but also the Red Fort in Delhi, the Jama Masjid Mosque, and dozens of other magnificent buildings. He had a passion for beauty, and for the demonstration of that beauty in stone and marble that has left the world permanently richer. He also loved his wife Mumtaz Mahal with a devotion that was, by contemporary accounts, genuinely remarkable. She died in 1631, in childbirth with their 14th child. The grief that followed was profound and lasting, and it led, eventually, to the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan's relationship with food reflected his aesthetic sensibilities. His court was probably the most elaborate in the Mughal dynasty's history, the most formally organized, the most attentive to ritual and ceremony, the most concerned with visual presentation and symbolic meaning. And the kitchen was no exception. The food at Shah Jahan's court reached a level of elaboration that was genuinely extraordinary. The dishes became more complex, the spice blends more sophisticated, the presentations more theatrical. There was an increasing interest in color. Dishes of different colors arranged together. Saffron yellow rice, contrasting with the dark red of a meat preparation and the white of yogurt-enriched dishes. Food as art, essentially. It was under Shah Jahan that the biryani seems to have reached its most refined court form. The dum biryani, the sealed pot biryani that we discussed, was prepared with increasing sophistication. Better quality meats, more complex spice blends, the careful addition of aromatic waters in precisely measured amounts. The biryani of the Shah Jahani court was probably the template from which all subsequent refined biryani traditions descended. The court also developed increasingly elaborate sweets during this period. The Mughal sweet tradition was already rich. Halwa of various kinds, the dense, sweet, ghee-rich preparations that used semolina or flour or ground nuts as a base. Here, rice cooked in milk until it thickens into a creamy pudding, flavored with cardamom and saffron and rose. Shahi tukta, fried bread soaked in sweetened, saffron-flavored milk. These were all established at this point. But the elaboration continued. One development worth mentioning is the increasing sophistication of the court's confectionery tradition. sweets made from sugar or jaggery with various nuts and flavorings. Essentially what we would recognize as candy became more varied and more refined. Sugar, which had been a luxury even for the wealthy, was becoming more accessible as Indian sugarcane cultivation expanded. This made elaborate confectionery possible on a larger scale. Shah Jahan was also known to have strong opinions about the quality of the water used in his court. There is a famous account of his particular preference for water from the Ganges River. He had it transported to wherever he was, even on campaign, because he considered it purer and better tasting than local water sources. This is both a practical preference. The Ganges at certain points and seasons does have exceptionally clean, cold water from Himalayan sources, and a symbolic one given the Ganges' sacred status in Hindu tradition. The emperor whose court was the most overtly Islamic in its aesthetic sensibilities, elaborate calligraphy, strict court ceremony organized around Islamic concepts of kingship, was drinking water associated with a Hindu sacred river. These contradictions and overlaps are everywhere in Mughal court culture. Shah Jahan was deposed by his son Aurangzeb in 1658 and spent the last 8 years of his life imprisoned in the Agra fort, looking out at the Taj Mahal he had built for his dead wife. His food in those years was provided by his daughter Jahanara, who stayed with him through his imprisonment and who, it is said, maintained what dignity and comfort she could for him in those circumstances. Whether this included maintaining anything like court-quality food, we don't entirely know. But the contrast between the imperial kitchens of his reign at their height and the reduced circumstances of his final years is deeply poignant. Aurangzeb is one of those historical figures who is genuinely difficult to be straightforward about because his legacy is deeply contested, and the debates around him are still very much alive. But for our purposes tonight, food purposes, what matters is this. Aurangzeb was the most religiously austere of the major Mughal emperors, and his austerity extended to food in ways that significantly changed the character of the court. He ruled from 1658 to 1707. That is 49 years, the longest reign of any Mughal emperor, and he worked through most of it with a diligence and personal austerity that was quite different from his predecessors. He stopped drinking wine entirely. He stopped consuming opium, which had been a feature of Mughal court life for generations. He reduced the court's music and entertainment. There are accounts of him disbanding court musicians and sending them away. He reduced the elaborateness of court ceremony, and he reduced the elaborateness of court food. This is not to say that the court under Aurangzeb ate badly. The imperial kitchen continued to function. The nobles and officials of his court continued to eat well. But the extravagant ceremonial around food, the theatrical presentation, the elaborate spice blends developed for aesthetic rather than merely practical effect, the culture of culinary refinement as an expression of imperial prestige, all of this was toned down. Aurangzeb himself ate simply by imperial standards. He favored plain rice, dal, and simple bread. He was a man who genuinely seemed to believe that personal austerity was a religious virtue and tried to live by it. Whether this was entirely authentic or partially performative is the kind of question historians debate, but the material record suggests that his personal habits were significantly simpler than those of Akbar or Shah Jahan. The effect on the broader court was complicated. The kitchen didn't disappear. The cooks didn't leave. But the cultural energy around food, the attention to refinement and innovation, the competition among noble kitchens to outdo each other in culinary sophistication diminished. The center of gravity for Mughal court cuisine began to shift, in a sense, away from the imperial court itself and toward the regional courts and the homes of Mughal nobles who spread out across the empire. This is actually one of the reasons Mughal cuisines have been so influential and so widely distributed. When the central court was the dominant cultural force, culinary innovation was concentrated there. But as the empire fragmented in the 18th century, as regional successor states emerged, as the Nawabs of Lucknow and Hyderabad and Bengal developed their own courts, Mughal culinary traditions were distributed and adapted. Each regional court developed its own version of the Mughal culinary tradition, shaped by local ingredients, local tastes, and local circumstances. The Lucknow kitchen, the culinary tradition associated with the Nawabs of Awadh, is probably the most celebrated of these regional Mughal offshoots. It developed what came to be known as the Nawabi or Dumpuk style, characterized by extreme delicacy of spicing, long slow cooking, and dishes that were almost cloud-like in their lightness, despite being made from the same basic ingredients as the Mughal court tradition. The galudi kebab, a minced meat preparation so finely textured that it was said to have been invented for a Nawab who had lost his teeth, is the emblematic dish of this tradition. But we're getting into the 18th century, and I want to bring us back to the Mughal court in its glory days a bit longer. Let's talk about the big occasions, the feasts, the events where the Mughal court went from absurdly well-fed on a Tuesday to something genuinely medieval in its extravagance. The Mughal calendar was organized around several major celebrations. The two great Islamic festivals, Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan and Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice, were major court events with elaborate ceremonies, distributions of gifts, and feasts. The Persian New Year, Nowruz, was also celebrated at the Mughal court, even though the Mughals were Muslim, reflecting the deep Persian cultural influence on the dynasty. Nowruz was traditionally a massive, multi-day celebration involving special foods associated with the new year. The Imperial birthday, the weighing ceremony, in which the emperor was literally weighed against gold and precious materials that were then distributed as charity, was another major occasion. And there were the celebrations of military victories, the accessions of new emperors, the marriages of imperial children. At these occasions, the kitchen was essentially operating at full emergency capacity. The quantities of food produced were staggering. And this is at a court where the everyday production was already staggering. We're talking about feasts that might serve hundreds or even thousands of people, arranged in elaborate order of rank and protocol, served from different levels of the kitchen hierarchy, depending on who you were. European visitors to the Mughal court who witnessed these feasts were almost uniformly astonished. They described the quantity of dishes, the sequence of courses, the elaborateness of the presentation, the speed and organization with which enormous quantities of food were produced and served. Thomas Rowe, the English ambassador at Jahangir's court, describes imperial feasts with barely concealed amazement at their scale. What would actually be served at such a feast? The sequence would typically begin with the simpler, lighter dishes, soups perhaps, though Mughal court soup was not the thin broth of European soup tradition. Something more like the shorba, a spiced aromatic broth with meat, sometimes thickened with ground almonds or other starches, served hot and fragrant. Then the bread would come, fresh naan and roti in quantities sufficient for the entire assembly. Then the main dishes, an array of meat preparations, korma, rogan josh, various kebabs, slow-braised whole birds, grilled game. Alongside these, the rice dishes, pilaf, biryani, khichdi for those who preferred it. Then the vegetable and lentil dishes. Then the condiments, pickles and chutneys and raitas and various sauces. And then the sweets. The dessert course at a Mughal imperial feast was its own substantial event. Halwa, kheer, various milk-based sweets made with nuts and sugar, seasonal fresh fruits, cleaned and presented, dried fruits, the figs and dates and raisins that were always present on the court table. And then the bedel to finish. Beverages would flow throughout, primarily non-alcoholic at formal court events, though the informal culture of the court, particularly under Akbar and Jahangir, was considerably more relaxed. Sharbat, flavored cold drinks made with fruit juices and flowers and spices and sweetened water, were served. In the hot months, these would be chilled with ice brought from the mountains, packed in straw, and transported by fast relay. This was a logistical operation of some complexity and expense. Cold drinks in the Indian summer heat. Cold drinks made from rosewater and lime and sugar, chilled with mountain ice. This is, in fact, one of the more appealing images from Mughal court life. The emperor sitting in a garden pavilion, surrounded by the sound of fountains, drinking a cold, fragrant sharbat while the summer heat pressed in from outside the garden walls. Not bad. As an afternoon, we've been at the Imperial table for quite a while now. Let's walk out of the palace and talk about what everyone else was eating. The Mughal Empire, at its height, contained somewhere between 100 and 150 million people, depending on which estimate you use. The overwhelming majority of these people were farmers, artisans, merchants, and laborers who had essentially nothing in common with the imperial court, except that they happened to live within its political boundaries. Their food was determined by what grew where they lived, what they could afford, what their local traditions were, and what season it was. The subcontinent under Mughal rule was agriculturally diverse in ways that are hard to overstate. The Bengal Delta grew enormous quantities of rice and fish. The Punjab was a breadbasket of wheat. The Deccan Plateau had its own agricultural patterns. Kashmir produced saffron, walnuts, and apples. The coastal regions had fish and coconuts. The interior of the continent had cattle herds and millet cultivation. What most ordinary people ate was very simple by court standards. Rice or bread, depending on what region they lived in, formed the base of their daily diet. On top of this went whatever protein was available and affordable. For most ordinary people, this meant dal, lentils, which were cheap, nutritious, and filling. They also ate vegetables, the particular vegetables that were seasonal and local. They ate yogurt. They ate pickles. They might have eaten small quantities of meat or fish if they could afford it. Though for many households, this was a weekly or monthly occurrence rather than a daily one. The spicing in ordinary households was real and present, but not as elaborate as the court. The basic technology of the tadka, frying spices in oil or ghee and adding them to a dish, was universal. Cumin, mustard seeds, turmeric, dried chili by the 17th century, garlic, ginger, these were the workhorses of everyday Indian cooking at every social level. The court had the same spices plus the more expensive aromatic ingredients like saffron and rosewater and mace. But the fundamental approach to seasoning was shared. Religious dietary restrictions shaped ordinary food as well. The Hindu population, which was the majority throughout the Mughal period, had varying levels of observance around vegetarianism, beef avoidance, and ritual purity in food preparation. Many high-caste Hindu communities were strictly vegetarian. The Jain community was vegetarian, with additional restrictions around root vegetables. Muslim communities avoided pork. Different communities had different fasting practices, different food-related religious calendars. So, Mughal rule was generally, though not always, particularly under Aurangzeb, relatively tolerant of this diversity. The Mughals collected taxes from their subjects regardless of religion, which gave them a practical incentive to maintain a population that was functional and not in a state of constant religious revolt. Akbar, in particular, actively tried to accommodate Hindu religious practices and sensibilities, and this included a degree of official respect for Hindu food customs. There were, periodically, tensions around food as a flashpoint of religious identity, particularly around cow slaughter, which was sacred to Hindu practice and normal in Muslim culinary tradition. Some Mughal emperors, Akbar included, restricted cow slaughter in areas with significant Hindu populations as a political gesture of accommodation. For ordinary people, food was also subject to the larger forces of the agricultural economy: drought, flood, failed harvests, famine. The Mughal Empire experienced famines, most notably the Great Famine of 1630–32, which struck during Shah Jahan's reign and killed millions of people. This famine is a devastating counterpoint to the elaborate biryani making happening in the imperial kitchen at the same time. The empire was wealthy enough at its center to maintain extraordinary opulence, and fragile enough at edges that a bad monsoon could kill millions. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it's an honest part of the story of food in the Mughal Empire. Let's come back to something pleasant. The Mughals were obsessed with fruit in a way that even their obsession with meat couldn't quite match. We've already talked about Babur's grief over the melons. This was not idiosyncratic. It was part of a deep cultural tradition in which high-quality fruit was a luxury item of the highest order, worthy of being given as a gift, written about in poetry, and served at the imperial table as a centerpiece. The fruits of Central Asia that the early Mughals missed so much were magnificent in their way: the melons of Samarkand, the grapes of Kabul, the pomegranates and plums and peaches of the hill country. These were brought to India in the form of seedlings and cuttings whenever possible, planted in imperial gardens, and served when they could be grown successfully. But India had something Central Asia could not match. India had the mango. The mango is one of the great fruits of the world. If you have never eaten a good mango, truly good, ripe, fragrant, the kind that drips down your chin and perfumes the air, then a significant portion of the human experience of pleasure has been withheld from you. The Indian subcontinent has been cultivating mangoes for thousands of years and has developed hundreds of varieties, each with its own flavor profile, texture, seasonality, and regional identity. The Mughals were not initially prepared for how good mangoes were. They had no reference point. Babur's initial assessment, that mangoes were acceptable, was an underreaction that later emperors thoroughly corrected. By the time of Akbar, the mango was fully established as the supreme fruit of the Mughal court. Akbar maintained a mango grove of 100,000 trees at Lak Bagh. 100,000. That is not a garden. That is an infrastructure project. The different varieties of mango were known by name, and their qualities debated with the kind of intensity that wine enthusiasts debate vintages. There was the Langra, the Dusseri, the Chauza, the Fazli, each with its devotees in its proper season. The best mangoes were served to the emperor first, obviously, and then distributed according to rank. Receiving a mango from the imperial grove as a gift was an honor. Jahangir wrote about mangoes in his memoirs with genuine affection. He is said to have considered them one of the few aspects of India that was clearly superior to anything the Persianate world had to offer. Coming from Jahangir, this is a significant concession. The other great achievement of Mughal fruit culture was the introduction of cold fruit. Fruit chilled with mountain ice, or suspended in cold water, served to cut through the heat. Sharbats made from fruit juices. Mango, lime, tamarind, pomegranate, sweetened and chilled, were the prestige beverages of the court during the summer months. The logistics of getting ice to Agra or Delhi or Lahore from the Himalayan foothills in the pre-refrigeration era was genuinely impressive. Ice was cut from mountain streams in winter and packed in insulated containers. Thick wrappings of straw or felt and transported by fast relay system to wherever the court was located. By the time it arrived, some of it had melted, but enough remained to chill drinks and to serve with chilled fruit. The emperor having a cold drink on a hot day while his subjects sweltered was, again, not a comfortable thing to dwell on. But the ice logistics of the Mughal court are genuinely interesting as a feat of pre-industrial supply chain management. Other fruits that appeared at the Mughal table include bananas, which were widely grown throughout the subcontinent, lychees from Bengal, jackfruit, a massive, sweet, complex tropical fruit that is one of the more remarkable plants in the world, coconuts from the coastal regions, and dried fruits from Central Asia and Persia, figs, dates, raisins, dried apricots, which arrived by the trade routes that connected the Mughal Empire to its cultural homeland. The Mughal sweet tradition is so rich and varied that it deserves substantial attention. The central category of Mughal court dessert was halwa, a class of preparations that have essentially nothing in common with the Western sesame paste product that shares the name. Mughal halwa was made by cooking semolina, flour, or groundnuts with ghee until the mixture was fragrant and somewhat dry, then adding sugar syrup and aromatics and cooking further until the mixture formed a cohesive, rich, slightly dense sweet. Suji halwa, semolina halwa, is one of the great comfort foods of the Indian subcontinent, served at celebrations, religious occasions, and as everyday sweetness. At the Mughal court, it was made with extraordinary quality ingredients. The finest semolina, pure ghee, saffron, cardamom, topped with blanched almonds and pistachios. A dish that is essentially humble in its structure is made magnificent by the quality of its components. Gajar halwa, carrot halwa, is made by slow-cooking grated carrots in ghee and milk until the mixture reduces and caramelizes, then finishing with sugar, cardamom, and nuts. This is a winter dish, because winter is when carrots are at their best and sweetest. The process of making it properly is slow. It requires constant attentions and stirring as the liquid cooks off. But the result is something between a vegetable dish and a confection. Deeply orange, sticky sweet, rich. Kheer, the rice pudding of the Mughal court, was made by slow-cooking fine rice in whole milk, stirring constantly to prevent sticking until the milk reduced significantly, and the rice was completely soft, and the whole mixture had thickened into a creamy, slightly sticky pudding. This was then flavored with saffron, rosewater, cardamom, and topped with blanched pistachios and sometimes silver leaf, actual edible silver, hammered into translucent sheets. Silver leaf, called varak in Hindi, is worth mentioning because it is another marker of extreme refinement at the Mughal court. Edible silver and gold leaf was applied to sweets and to certain savory dishes as a finish, adding nothing to the flavor, but a great deal to the visual presentation and to the symbolic statement of the dish's preciousness. It is still used in Indian sweets today, though less universally than in the Mughal court tradition. Shahi tukta, literally royal piece, was a dessert made from fried bread soaked in sweetened, thickened, saffron-flavored milk and topped with cream and nuts. The combination of the fried bread, the sweet milk, and the richness of cream and nuts is excessive in the most satisfying possible way. This was court food, not something for every day, and its name acknowledges this. The milk-based sweet tradition that characterizes so much of North Indian and Pakistani dessert culture has deep Mughal roots. Chena, a fresh curd cheese similar to paneer but more crumbly, is the basis of an entire category of sweets: rasgulla, sandesh, chum chum, and many others. These sweets have Bengali origins primarily, and the influence of Bengal on the broader Indian sweet tradition is enormous. But the Mughal court's proximity to Bengal and the flow of goods and culinary knowledge between the court and the prosperous Bengali region contributed to the distribution of these sweets more widely. Sugar was the critical ingredient, and its availability determined who could access sweetness. Refined sugar, white sugar, was expensive and prestigious. Jaggery, unrefined cane sugar, with a more complex, slightly molasses-like flavor, was the everyday sweetener for most people. The court used refined sugar lavishly. Ordinary people sweetened with jaggery. There were also sugar confections, essentially candy, made from sugar cooked to different stages and mixed with nuts or spices or flavorings. Mithai, the broad category of Indian sweets, encompasses an enormous range of preparations, and many of the most elaborate ones have clear Mughal court influences in their ingredients and techniques. After all the sweets came the beetle, and after the beetle came rest. We've mentioned drinks several times throughout this script, but they deserve their own section because the Mughal approach to beverages was both elaborate and influential. The word sharbat, the Arabic and Persian word for a cold, sweetened, flavored drink, is the ancestor of the English words sherbet and sorbet. This linguistic lineage tells you something about the prestige and reach of the Mughal Persianate drink tradition. Sharbat was prepared from various bases: fruit juices, flower essences, herbal infusions, sweetened with sugar syrup, and diluted with water, then ideally chilled. The sharbat of the Mughal court was not a simple thing. It was a specialty item, prepared by skilled sharbat makers, sharbatdars, who had their own position in the court hierarchy. Common bases for sharbat included rosewater or rose syrup combined with water and sugar, producing a pink, intensely fragrant drink that is cooling to drink and beautiful to look at. Rose sharbat is still served at celebrations across the region today. Lemon and lime, the sour citrus sharbat, what we might call a lemonade, was popular in the hot months. The juice was sweetened with sugar, and the whole thing chilled if possible. Tamarind, the sour, slightly sweet, deeply complex flavor of tamarind makes an excellent sharbat base. Tamarind is also considered cooling in the humoral medical tradition, which made it particularly appropriate for hot weather. Sandalwood, yes, the wood used in incense. Sandalwood has a subtle fragrance and, in the medical tradition of the time, cooling properties. Drink made with sandalwood essence was considered both pleasant and medicinally beneficial. Hoos, vetiver grass root, had a distinctive, earthy, slightly woody fragrance and was considered particularly cooling. Koos sharbat in hot weather was a staple of both the court and the broader population. Pomegranate, the deep, sweet, tart juice of pomegranate, was a festive and luxurious sharbat. Pomegranates were also associated with Persian culture, making them symbolically appropriate for a court that drew so much from the Persianate tradition. Milk-based drinks were also important. Lassi, yogurt beaten with water, either plain or sweetened with sugar and flavored with rosewater or salted and spiced, was drunk throughout the day. It was cooling, filling, and digestively beneficial. Thandai, a milk drink prepared with a paste of ground nuts, seeds and spices, including cardamom, rose petals, black pepper, and sometimes, in certain contexts and certain social situations, with a cannabis preparation added, was served at festivals. Coffee and tea are not significantly part of the early Mughal court story. Coffee was known in the Islamic world from the 16th century onward and gradually spread, but it did not become a major feature of Mughal court culture in the early period. Tea would become important in India, primarily after British commercial interests began promoting it heavily in the 19th century, much later than our story. Let's take a moment to think about the practical side of Mughal court food production. We've talked about what was cooked. Let's talk briefly about how the technology of the kitchen, the tandoor we've already discussed, the buried clay oven that produced naan and various grilled preparations. Every large kitchen had at least one tandoor, and the imperial kitchen had many. The baking of bread at court was essentially a continuous operation. The primary cooking vessels were copper pots of various sizes. Copper conducts heat evenly and allow for fine temperature control, which is important for the slow-cooked, sauce-based preparations that were central to the Mughal kitchen. The inside of these pots was lined with tin. Copper reacts with acidic foods and can be toxic in sufficient quantities. The tinning had to be periodically redone as it wore off, and there were specialists who did this work. Large, wide, flat-bottomed pans, essentially giant versions of what we'd call a sauté pan, were used for cooking rice dishes and for the final stages of biryani preparation. Clay pots were used for slow cooking, particularly for preparations that benefited from the gentle, slightly uneven heat that clay provides, and from the slight minerally quality that clay can impart to a dish. The fuel for all this cooking was primarily wood and charcoal. Managing the fire, getting it to the right temperature, maintaining it through a long cooking process, adjusting it as needed, was a skill in itself. The kitchen workers who managed the fires were not the same people who were cooking the food. There was a division of labor even within the fire management. Grinding and pounding were fundamental operations. Before the age of mechanized food processing, every spice blend had to be ground by hand, typically in a stone mortar and pestle or on a grinding stone. This is labor-intensive work. The kitchen staff spent significant portions of their working day grinding spices, grinding meat for kebabs, grinding nuts for sauces and sweets. The kitchen sounds would have been dominated by the rhythmic thud and scrape of grinding, interspersed with the sizzle of frying and the bubble of simmering pots. Meat for the kebab preparations was minced by hand, a process of repeated chopping with heavy cleavers on a chopping block, sometimes combined with grinding in a mortar to produce the ultra-fine, smooth texture that distinguished court kebabs from rougher preparations. The galuti kebab of Lucknow, which we mentioned earlier, requires meat so finely processed that it was historically achieved by mincing it up to 100 times. This is dedicated work. The kitchen operated by firelight, largely, though some natural light came through high windows. It was hot. It was smoky. The smell would have been extraordinary. The accumulated fragrance of decades of spice cooking embedded in the walls, mixed with the fresh smells of each day's production. It was, by any objective standard, a difficult place to work. But for the skilled craftspeople at the top of the kitchen hierarchy, it was also a place of mastery and, in a limited way, of creative expression. One of the things that makes the study of Mughal court cuisine both exciting and frustrating is the question of written sources. What was actually written down? What recipes do we have? How reliable are they? The Ain-i-Akbari, which we've referenced repeatedly, is the most important single source for the structure and organization of the Mughal court kitchen under Akbar. Abul Fazl is careful and detailed, and his account has the feel of someone who actually talked to the kitchen staff and looked at their records. The actual recipes he provides are relatively few and somewhat schematic. He's not writing a cookbook. He's writing an administrative manual, but they give us the outlines of dishes and their key ingredients. The Babur Nama gives us Babur's first-person perspective on food, invaluable for its candor and its specificity, but it's a memoir, not a recipe collection. The Tazuk-i-Jahangiri gives us Jahangir's food opinions and observations, similarly personal and opinionated. There are also several cookbooks that survive from the Mughal period and its aftermath, though most of them are from the later period of the empire, or from the regional courts that descended from it. The Nushka-i-Shah Jahani, a cookbook compiled during Shah Jahan's reign, is one of the earliest detailed recipe collections from the Mughal tradition. It provides actual recipes with ingredients and sometimes methods, though the methods are often more abbreviated than a modern reader might like. Later works from the Nawabi courts of Lucknow and Hyderabad provide more detailed recipes and show how the Mughal culinary tradition evolved in different regional contexts. The problem is that so much of what was cooked in the Mughal kitchen was transmitted not through texts, but through people. Through the oral and practical tradition of master cooks training their successors, through the knowledge carried in the hands and noses and taste memories of kitchen professionals. This kind of knowledge is very hard to preserve when political systems collapse and courts disperse. The fall of the Mughal Empire, the gradual shrinking and fragmentation of the court in the 18th century, the final humiliation by the British after the 1857 uprising, scattered the court culture, including its culinary culture. Cooks who had worked in the imperial kitchens or in noble households went elsewhere. Some went to the regional successor courts. Some ended up in the homes of newly wealthy families, merchants, minor landowners, who wanted to eat in a prestigious style. Some eventually ended up in the restaurants that began to emerge in the growing cities of the 19th century. Through all of these migrations, knowledge was preserved and transmitted, imperfectly, selectively, but persistently. The biryani that is cooked in homes and restaurants across South Asia today carries within it the memory of the Mughal dum biryani, the korma that appears on Pakistani and Indian restaurant menus around the world is descended through many generations of adaptation from the Mughal court preparation. The naan that is eaten with every meal in North Indian and Pakistani cooking was shaped in the tandoors of the imperial kitchen. The continuity is real and documentable, even if the intervening history is complicated. The Mughal Empire began its long decline after Aurangzeb's death in 1707. He had expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, but the expansion had come at enormous cost, both military and economic. The prolonged campaigns in the Deccan had drained the treasury and stretched the administrative capacity of the empire to breaking point. After his death, the empire fragmented rapidly. There were 12 emperors in the 50 years after Aurangzeb's death, none of whom had the political or military capacity to hold the empire together. And through all of this political disintegration, the imperial kitchen kept running. This is both fascinating and slightly absurd, as the real power of the Mughal emperors dwindled to almost nothing, as they became essentially prisoners of whoever happened to be the dominant power in Delhi at any given moment, whether the Marathas or the Rohillas, or eventually the British. The ceremonial apparatus of the court continued. Emperors who controlled almost nothing still had their kitchen superintendents and their food tasters and their sealed dishes. The ceremony persisted even as the substance evaporated. By the reign of the later emperors, Akbar II, Bahadur Shah II, the last emperor who was tried for his role in the 1857 uprising and exiled to Rangoon, the court was a shadow of what it had been. The British East India Company and then the British Crown controlled the real levers of power. The emperor's budget was a fraction of what it had been under Akbar or Shah Jahan. The kitchen still functioned, but on a vastly reduced scale. Bahadur Shah II, Bahadur Shah Zafar, is a poignant figure in this context. He was a poet, genuinely talented, whose verses are still read and admired in Urdu literature. He was a ruler with no real power, and he was, like all Mughal emperors, surrounded by food rituals that must have seemed increasingly hollow as his political situation deteriorated. He was exiled after the 1857 uprising, which the British called the Sepoy Mutiny and which Indians call the First War of Independence. And he died in Rangoon in 1862. His last meals were far from the elaborate productions of the Mughal court at its height. The last emperor of the Mughals died in exile, an old man in a foreign city, having eaten, at various points in his life, both the most elaborate food of the most opulent court in Asia and the simple meals of a prisoner. Here is a remarkable thing. The Mughal Empire is gone. It has been gone for over a century and a half, if we date its end to the exile of Bahadur Shah Zafar in 1858. But the food it created is still everywhere, not as a museum piece, not as a reconstruction, as living, breathing, daily cuisine that people cook in their homes and eat in restaurants and argue about and feel nostalgic for. The biryani, the korma, the rogan josh, the naan, the Sikh kebab, the Shami kebab, the dal makhani, the kheer, the halwa. These are not archaic dishes that food historians have to reconstruct from manuscripts. These are dishes that are eaten every day by hundreds of millions of people across South Asia and by the South Asian diaspora around the world. When a Pakistani family in London cooks biryani on Eid, they are participating in a culinary tradition that runs directly back to the sealed pots of the Mughal Imperial kitchen. When an Indian restaurant in New York serves butter chicken, which is a mid-20th century invention, admittedly, but one built on Mughal court foundations, it is drawing on a culinary heritage that is 500 years old. This is the remarkable continuity of food. Political empires rise and fall, dynasties end, courts disperse. But the knowledge of how to cook certain things, the taste memory of what those things should taste like, the cultural identity invested in particular dishes, these persist. The Mughal court cuisine also shaped the way the world understands Indian food. The Mughal tradition, particularly as filtered through the restaurant culture that developed first in the cities of the Indian subcontinent and then in the diaspora restaurants of Britain, North America, and elsewhere, became the dominant representation of Indian food internationally. This is both a tribute to the power and prestige of the Mughal culinary tradition and a slight distortion because the Indian subcontinent has dozens of distinct culinary traditions, many of them equally rich and complex, that are not as well represented internationally. The food of coastal India, the coconut-rich curries of Kerala, the seafood preparations of the Konkan coast, the distinctive cuisine of Goa, the food of Tamil Nadu and the other southern states, which is its own extraordinary world of rice and lentil dishes and tamarind-based curries and breakfast foods. The food of Bengal with its fish and its mustard oil and its incomparable sweets. All of these are different from the Mughal-influenced North Indian tradition and equally worthy of attention. But tonight, we have been at the Mughal table, and it has been a very long and thoroughly satisfying meal. Before we begin to wind down for the evening, let's spend a little time on a question that we've been circling around throughout this script without quite addressing directly. Why did the Mughals eat the way they did? The elaborate, expensive, ceremonially complex food culture of the Mughal court was not arbitrary. It was the expression of a set of ideas about what food meant, what it communicated, what it accomplished. Food, in the Mughal world, was power. The emperor who fed people was the emperor who had power over people. The distribution of food from the imperial kitchen to nobles, to visiting dignitaries, to the poor at festivals was not just generosity. It was a demonstration of the abundance that flowed from the emperor's rule. It was the emperor saying, "Look at how much I have. Look at how much I can share. Look at what you receive by being within my domain." This is a political argument made through food, and it was a very effective one. Food was also identity. The Mughals were a Central Asian dynasty ruling over a predominantly Hindu subcontinent with a court culture that was deeply Persianate. Their food reflected all of these identities simultaneously. The Persianate refinement of spice and rice and slow cooking, the Central Asian tradition of meat and flatbread, the Indian ingredients and techniques that were gradually integrated. What the court ate was a statement of who the court was. Food was also medicine. In the Unani Ayurvedic framework that informed court medicine, the kitchen was, in a sense, a therapeutic institution as well as a culinary one. What the emperor ate was managed with his health in mind, and the categories of hot and cold, heavy and light, that informed the medical understanding of food were genuinely incorporated into kitchen decisions. And food was pleasure. Let's not underestimate this. The Mughals liked eating. They liked it a lot. The attention they paid to the quality of their food, the obsessive sourcing of ingredients, the cultivation of specialist cooks, the elaborate ritual of meals, reflects people who found genuine pleasure in the experience of eating well. This is not shameful or frivolous. It is human. The Mughal garden, Babur's great contribution to the Indian landscape, was also a food garden. It produced fruit. It provided the context for outdoor dining. The garden pavilion, the sound of fountains, the shade of trees, the smell of flowers, mixed with the smell of whatever was cooking. This was an aesthetic experience in which food and environment were deliberately integrated. Eating in the Mughal garden was not just eating. It was a sensory composition. The idea that beautiful surroundings enhance the experience of food is not unique to the Mughals, it's universal. But the Mughals elevated it to an art form. Let's take a slower walk through a few specific dishes. The ones we know enough about to describe in some detail, because they were either documented in contemporary sources or because their modern descendants are sufficiently close to the original to give us a reasonable sense of what they were. Murg masalam. This dish, a whole chicken marinated and stuffed and cooked whole, appears in Mughal period sources and is still prepared today in various forms. The Mughal version would have involved marinating the whole bird in yogurt, spices, and aromatics for an extended period. The yogurt tenderizes the meat and the spices penetrate deeply. The bird would then be stuffed with a filling of spiced minced meat or rice or a combination of both. It would be cooked by roasting or by the dum method, sealed in a pot and cooked slowly in its own juices and those of the spices and aromatics packed around it. The result is a whole bird that is intensely flavored all the way through. Tender enough to pull apart with fingers, fragrant with spice slices, with a stuffing that has absorbed all the juices of the cooking bird. This is not a subtle dish, but it is a magnificent one. Yakhni pulao. Yakhni the broth. This is a preparation made by simmering meat with whole spices, cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, bay leaf, black pepper, and aromatics like onion and ginger, then straining to produce a clear, intensely flavored stock. This stock is then used to cook the rice. The result is rice that is flavored from within, not from spices mixed in, but from the cooking liquid itself. The yakhni pulao of the Mughal court was probably made with the finest goat or mutton, the highest quality rice, and the most careful management of the whole cooking process. The rice would have served with the pieces of meat from the stock making, which would have been returned after straining, perhaps fried briefly to color them, and arranged on top of the finished rice. Dum biryani. We've described the technique. Let's describe the experience of the finished dish. When the sealed pot is opened at the table, there is a moment of anticipation, and then the steam rises, carrying with it a complex fragrance that is almost impossible to describe in its entirety. Saffron and rosewater and cardamom and the caramelized onion and the meat cooking in its juices and the rice absorbing all of it. Then the layers are gently separated. The fried onions on top, the color of deep mahogany, the saffron yellow rice, the pieces of tender meat, the herbs scattered through. Each portion should contain all the layers, the yellow and the white of the rice, the brown of the meat, the gold of the onions. Eating a great biryani is, genuinely, one of the pleasures of human life. Korma. The korma of the Mughal court was a slow-braised meat dish made by first browning onions until very deep and rich, almost caramelized, then adding the meat with spices, followed by yogurt in small additions, allowing each addition to be absorbed before adding the next. This process, the gradual integration of yogurt into the sauce, produces a sauce that is silky, rich, and deeply flavored, without the graininess that comes from adding too much liquid at once. The finished dish has a sauce that coats the meat thickly, that is the color of dark amber, that tastes of a dozen spices in a balance so careful that no single spice dominates. Properly made korma is one of the most complex and satisfying things in Indian cooking. Dal makhani, black urad dal, whole, unprocessed black lentils, are soaked and then cooked very slowly, traditionally overnight, until they are completely soft and their skins have begun to break down. Butter and cream are added in generous quantities. tomatoes, which arrived in India from the New World at some point, though exactly when they became standard in Mughal tradition cooking is debated, provide acidity. Spices are kept relatively simple. The result is a dish of extraordinary richness and depth, dark in color, thick, deeply satisfying. Dal makhani is not a peasant dish, or rather, it began as something more elaborate and luxurious and has since become democratized. But it retains the character of a dish that was made with good ingredients and time. We've talked about spices extensively, but there's another dimension worth adding, the political and economic dimension of where these spices came from and how they reached the Mughal kitchen. The Mughal Empire was well positioned within the spice trade routes of the early modern world. The subcontinent was itself a major producer of spices: black pepper from the Malabar coast, cardamom from the Western Ghats, turmeric and ginger widely grown, and it was also a transit point for spices coming from Southeast Asia and the islands of the Indonesian archipelago. Nutmeg, mace, and cloves came from the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and traveled by sea to the ports of the Indian coast before making their way inland to the Mughal markets. The Portuguese, who had established themselves on the Indian coast starting in the early 1500s, were major intermediaries in this trade for much of the 16th century. The Mughals and the Portuguese had a complicated relationship, sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile, but the flow of trade goods continued regardless of politics. Spices moved, money moved. Saffron was a special case. The saffron grown in Kashmir, which the Mughals controlled, was considered among the finest in the world and was exported widely as well as consumed at court. The saffron harvest was a significant economic event in Kashmir, and the quality of the crop each year was closely monitored. The increasing involvement of the European trading companies, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British and French East India companies, in the spice trade through the 17th and 18th centuries, gradually shifted the economic power of this trade away from the Indian merchants and rulers who had previously controlled significant portions of it. This is one of the longer-term economic stories that contributed to the eventual weakness of the Mughal Empire. Not directly, not simply, but as part of a complex restructuring of trade relationships that drew wealth away from the established powers of the Indian subcontinent. But in the heyday of the empire, under Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan, the spices flowed in. They went to the imperial kitchen and to the markets of the empire's great cities, Agra, Delhi, Lahore, Fatehpur Sikri, where merchants from across the known world bought and sold the aromatic substances that flavored the food of empires. We're getting toward the end of our evening now. It's been a long meal. A generous one, I hope, full of flavor and texture and the kind of detail that is satisfying at this hour when you're not quite asleep but not quite fully awake either, drifting through the story of a dynasty and its kitchens and its obsessive attention to the quality of its rice. Let's end where the Mughal Empire itself ended. Not with a bang, but with a slow fade, a gradual dimming of the lights, the kitchen growing quieter until eventually the fires went out. The last effective Mughal emperor was probably Aurangzeb. After him, it was emperors in name who struggled against increasing fragmentation. The great regional powers, the Marathas, the Sikhs, the Nizams of Hyderabad, the Nawabs of Awadh, rose to fill the power vacuum left by a weakened center. The British East India Company extended its control steadily through the 18th century, claiming revenue rights here, military control there, until by the early 19th century the emperor in Delhi was a pensioner of the company, receiving a stipend and presiding over a court that was essentially ceremonial. The food rituals continued bizarrely through all of this. As long as there was an emperor, there was an imperial kitchen, however reduced. The ceremonies of sealing and tasting and presenting dishes persisted. The betel was still served after meals. The court still organized itself around the ritual of the emperor's food, even when that emperor had no real power. There is something both touching and absurd about this persistence of ritual in the absence of the substance it once represented, the form maintained even as the content emptied out. A kitchen still cooking, still following the protocols, still producing the dishes of an empire that no longer quite existed. And then in 1857, the last emperor, the poet Bahadur Shah Zafar, became the nominal figurehead of the great uprising against British rule. He was an old man. He did not lead anyone anywhere. He provided symbolic legitimacy for a rebellion that was ultimately defeated. And after the defeat, the British put him on trial and exiled him to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. The Mughal Empire, which had fed millions and been fed by its own extraordinary kitchens for over 300 years, was over. But here is the thing that keeps pulling me back to this story tonight as we drift toward the end of our script. The kitchen survived. The knowledge survived. The people who had cooked in the Mughal tradition. The families who had passed down the recipes and techniques. The cooks who had trained in the courts of Mughal nobles. The women in whose homes the dishes had been prepared for generations. All of them carried the culinary heritage forward, into restaurants, into homes, into the new cities of the British colonial period, and then the independent nations of Pakistan and India, into the diaspora communities that spread across the world in the 20th century, into recipe books and food writing and the communal memory of a billion people who eat naan and biryani and korma, not because they are recreating history, but because these dishes are delicious and familiar and feel like home. The Mughal emperors are gone. The Red Fort is now a monument. The Taj Mahal is a tourist site. The Imperial Gardens are, many of them, ruins or shadows of what they were. But the food is still here, still being made, still being eaten, still carrying within it the accumulated wisdom of centuries of careful cooking. So that's where we'll leave it for tonight. We've traveled from Fergana to Agra and back. We've sat in Babur's garden while he wept over a melon that reminded him of home. We've watched Humayun absorb the Persian court's culinary refinement during his years of exile. We've toured Akbar's enormous, meticulously organized kitchen with its sealed dishes and its food tasters and its mountains of saffron. We've drunk wine, perhaps rather more than was strictly advisable, with Jahangir. We've watched Shah Jahan's kitchen reach its peak of elaboration and then dimmed the lights on the last sad years of his imprisonment. We've eaten simply with Aurangzeb, who did everything simply and ruined all the fun. And we've watched the court's food culture slowly decentralize as the empire itself fragmented, carrying its culinary heritage into the regional traditions that preserved it and transformed it. We've talked about rice and bread and meat and dal and fruit and sweets and spices and kitchen politics and water and ice and betel and the extraordinary, barely comprehensible scale of feeding an imperial court every single day for 300 years. And now it's late. The fires of the imperial kitchen are, metaphorically speaking, low. The cook has cleaned up and gone to sleep. The last of the biryani has been eaten. Every grain of saffron rice consumed, every piece of tender meat, every crispy-edged onion. The sweet dishes have been cleared. The betel has been offered and chewed and set aside. The sharbat glasses are empty. Outside the palace garden, in the hot Indian night, the city is quiet. The Mughal Empire, in all its complexity and splendor and occasional absurdity, is sleeping, and so, hopefully, are you. If you made it this far, all the way from Babur's melons to Bahadur Shah Zafar's exile, then you have done a magnificent thing. You have spent 2 hours in the kitchens of one of history's great empires, and I hope it was pleasant company for whatever it is you were drifting through tonight. The biryani will be here when you wake up. Good night, guys.